She's outside. She just went on the phone. We'll wait for 1 minute. Namaste and welcome back, everyone. We'll begin in exactly 1 minute. Requesting you all to please keep your phones on the flight mode or switched off because there's some interference in the Zoom call if it's on silent because of the networks. So just for the session, after you step out, you can turn it on and make your calls. But for the session, I request you to please keep it on flight mode or turn it off. Thank you.
Namaste and welcome to our first plenary session of the conference on the theme The Scope of Yoga Vis-a-vis Mental Health, Challenges, Prospects and Realistic Roadmaps.
इस प्लीनरी सेशन के वक्ता है डॉक्टर बेसल वैन डे कॉक। डॉक्टर बेसल मानसिक विक्षोभ के क्षेत्र में समुच्चय विश्व में प्रख्यात है। As Dr. Bessel is not present with us here, I request Dr. Ulka Natu, one of the finest gynecologists and obstetricians from Mumbai, to please be felicitated on behalf of Dr. Bessel. I request Dr. Bhalekarji, Principal of GS College, Yoga and Cultural Synthesis, to do the honors. Thank you. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is the founder and medical director of the Trauma Research Foundation in Brookline, Massachusetts. He is also a professor of psychiatry at the Boston University Medical School. Throughout his career, he has been at the forefront of research on traumatic stress and the development of clinical therapies to treat it. He has pioneered approaches that focus on calming the nervous system, increasing self-regulation skills, and grounding patients in the present. In his research, Dr. Kolk has worked with a variety of clinical approaches, including neurofeedback, EMDR, psychodrama, and yoga. He has published over 150 peer-reviewed scientific articles on traumatic stress, as well as 2 leading textbooks on the subject. He has taught across the US, in Europe, China, Japan, Israel, South America, and South Africa. Dr. van der Kolk's #1 New York Times bestseller, The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Treatment of Trauma, transforms our understanding of traumatic stress, revealing how it literally rearranges the brain's wiring, specifically areas dedicated to pleasure, engagement, control, and trust. He shows how these areas can be reactivated through innovative treatments, including bodywork, mindfulness techniques, yoga, and neurofeedback. इस सत्र में डॉक्टर बेसल हमें मानसिक अशांति एवं मानसिक क्षति के विषय से अवगत करेंगे तथा उन स्थितियों का योग के द्वारा कैसे निवारण किया जा सकता है उस पर प्रकाश डालेंगे.
Unfortunately, Dr. Bessel is unable to be with us live, but he graciously agreed to conduct the session a couple of days ago. Hence, now we will play the recording. Please note that there will be no Q&A for this particular session, as the questions were taken when Dr. Bessel were present live with us. Thank you.
I regret not being there in person. That would be wonderful to be back in Mumbai, which I had the pleasure of visiting back in 2001 for some length of time. And I specialize in trauma. And of course, India also knows about trauma. But in a way, what is interesting, my field, I'm a physician, I'm a doctor, psychiatrist, and before we started talking about trauma, nobody ever talked about trauma. When we first defined PTSD back in 1980, we said it is an extraordinary event outside the usual realm of human experience. And like it's extremely rare. It was not rare at all. About 50% of children in India are being beaten quite badly by their parents, for example. In the US, about a quarter of all women have the experience of rape, probably similar to India. People get killed in car accidents, people get killed in domestic violence things. It is very common. So, because nobody had seen it before, we discovered something. And it was mainly based on the military. And these are always cultural issues. Every country sees different things and pays attention to different things. And of course, America, having by far the largest army in the world and invading Iraq and Afghanistan and parts of Africa, has a very active army. And when you have an active army, you get people who get very messed up by the war. And so we defined PTSD on the basis of soldiers. And it took a while for us to discover that trauma is ubiquitous. Trauma actually is the main source of mental illness. Particularly having been beaten, molested, neglected, abandoned as a child has devastating effects on all kinds of mental health issues. And so we have been looking for how trauma works and what the impact is and what you can do about it. So here's an example. This is an explosion in September 2001 of the World Trade Center in New York. And we all had, people like me, knew a lot of people who were affected by that. As a trauma researcher, I went out to New York, spent a lot of time there afterwards to study what happened to people. And what we saw there, in response to this event, people started to run. So the normal response to a terrible event is to activate your flight-fight response. And not only do people run, but when something terrible happens, your body runs for home. So what you see here is the Brooklyn Bridge that runs from Manhattan into Brooklyn, and you see all these people running to go home. And what the research found is that if you can go home and somebody holds you, somebody takes care of you, and somebody looks after you, by and large, you do not get traumatized. And so human beings are tribal people, as in India, know all about it, and we depend on each other for safety and security. And most trauma is if the safety and security of your own tribe, of your own family, of your own network gets disturbed, then you get mentally hurt, and also physically. The term that Harry Harlow and Stephen Sumi, the people who studied monkeys in the same situation, used was uptight. So people become uptight, and their bodies become uptight. And if you're accustomed to getting hit or put down or humiliated, you freeze your body and you try not to feel. So I was really, my claim to fame is very much that I was one of the first people to point out that trauma is held in the body. And so this is a picture that came to mind to me while this event was happening in New York. This is the last page of my anatomy textbook medical school. I saw all that running and people just trying to get away. I said, yeah, he really got it. This is the picture. When people are really scared, their frontal lobe, the thinking part of the brain, disappears, and their limbic system, which is another part of the brain that's in charge of making your body move, getting away, fighting back, our primitive animal brain gets activated. And this happens under ordinary circumstances too. Maybe after leaving here today, you may be in a traffic thing where a car comes at you and you have to move away, and your body will just move also. It's a physical response about how close we are to each other to run away from danger or to get closer, etc., etc. So it's a primitive animal part of our brain. If you don't get traumatized, this is a momentary reaction. Your body takes over, you flee, you fight, you do something, and then you calm yourself down. But if it happens continuously, like if you live in an abusive environment, you become always uptight and you're always afraid that things will happen to you, and it goes into your body. And that piece of it leading into your body, for me, led me right into yoga, because it's very clear that the primitive part of your brain is not a part of your brain that talks, doesn't have language, doesn't understand things, it just does things. And when we are mentally disturbed, we just do things. We just become angry or become depressed. And people say, you shouldn't be depressed. And you go like, yeah, I wish I couldn't be depressed, but I am. And these are things we have no control over because they come from primitive parts of our brain. And so our question is, how do we get there? And the most important question is, how do we make ourselves feel safe? And that's very much what we saw in New York after the attack on the World Trade Center. I was down there, I took a lot of pictures. A lot of people were hugging each other. And that's what people do. We'll get traumatized, I'm sorry. They hold each other and they make physical contact that provide them with a sense of safety. And if that doesn't work, your body gets frozen in particular. It gets frozen in being angry all the time, or it gets frozen in being numb out and not to feel anything at all. And so it gets expressed in how you hold your body. There's a famous book from picture from the First World War of a man who's gone into a dissociative state, and you just sit there. And of course, we see people like that when we go around India. We see a lot of people who are clearly traumatized, who are either frozen or are agitated. So that's where it starts. And then you start to look more closely, and you get to see these people who come to see you because they're traumatized, and they sit in frozen, awkward, uptight ways. And that's beginning to get us a little bit into maybe yoga could help because their bodies are so frozen. So the next thing that happens is we learn about the brain. And I happen to be a member of the first team at Harvard to study, to do brain studies. And the studies we do are of what happens in the brain when people are exposed to extreme events. And eventually that leads us to yoga. So here's our brain. And wait a second. And when they talk to you, This is my frontal lobe. I explain things to you. I tell stories to you. I ask you how you're doing. That's all in your frontal lobe. It's a beautiful part of your brain. And if you don't have a frontal lobe, you're a very dysfunctional person. But trauma doesn't sit in this rational part of the brain. It sits in the back of your brain. In the part of your brain that Antonio Damasio calls the housekeeping of the body. So when you get mentally ill, when you get traumatized, your breathing is off, your appetite is off, the way you hold your bodies is off. The housekeeping of your body isn't working. It sits over here. And so coming from the West, our tradition is we talk. We talk till we blue in the face. And if talking doesn't work, we give people a pill. And then slowly we come to realize there's other things besides talking and taking pills. And that's a tradition that comes from Asia. Yoga from India, Tai Chi and Qigong from China, all part of the same tradition of moving your body to help to calm down your mind. And so those are areas, those are methods that I think were invented basically to help people deal with trauma. And so they can really experience, they can do something to quiet down that body that has become so disturbed by trauma. And so these different layers of the brain do different things. And your frontal lobe is about conscious awareness and about what am I going to do. And your limbic system is about what does it feel like? What's it like to listen to this guy talking right now? And more deep down below that, very far out of your conscious brain, is a survival brain, has to do with breathing, appetites, sleeping, all the little things that babies do. That is a very physical organization of your body over which you have very little control. So it turns out that trauma is lived out in the very primitive part of your brain, particularly the area of the brain having to do with the housekeeping of your body. If you deal with little babies, you can see what the brainstem does. What can little babies do? They can scream, they can sleep, they can move a little bit, they can breathe, they can poop, and they can pee, they can suck, and that's about it. And there's no further brain yet. And in mental health, we have sort of ignored that part of the brain, except that we discovered in trauma that very primitive part of the brain gets very affected by trauma. And then the question for me became, how do we get there? It turns out that your tradition allows people to go to the very primitive part of the brain. This is the area of the brain that decides for you whether things are dangerous or safe, and your conscious brain cannot do that for you. So then the question becomes, how do you deal with a body that's become stuck in fear, flight, fright, and shutting down? The first thing is to help to make it feel safe. How does a person feel safe in a loving community with people around him? The second thing you need to do is to do something that gives you a feeling, oh, I can protect myself. I can do something. I'm a competent person. The third thing, that's where yoga comes in, is an affect regulation, learning to regulate your emotions. Of course, in the West, in Europe and North America, how do people regulate emotions? Through alcohol and psychiatric drugs. And then through India, we discover is that we don't necessarily need to take drugs and chemicals to change our internal states, because it was invented a long time ago in India that you can actually regulate your body by the way you breathe and move and sit. A piece of knowledge that really never quite made it to Europe and North America until very recently. So how do you access the emotional brain? So again, it's this dichotomy between the rational frontal brain and the primitive housekeeping brain. If that fear and the terror and the horror sits in the back of your brain, how do you get there? Now, what research shows is that your rational thinking, figuring out part of your brain cannot get there. You cannot understand your way out of being angry. You can understand your way out of being shut down, terrified, feeling terrible about yourself. There's no pathways from over here to back there in your brain. So you cannot say, go to sleep now, there's nothing to worry about. It doesn't work. So the way that the brain is built up is that we have, again, if you hang out with little babies, you can see this, and little babies just have little instincts and they move in certain ways, and you see them slowly build up a relationship between themselves and the world around them. And then the brain starts to grow. On either side of your brain, you develop a left brain to understand things and a right brain to really understand the meaning of things. What all means. That's it. Most of the brain development is about me in relationship to each other. But what we know today is there's another part of the brain. And that's the part of the brain we call the midline structures, the cortex, area of the brain over here, that is devoted to you. So if for a moment, as we started off today, we start off singing and chanting and breathing, we go inside, we no longer communicate with the outside world primarily, we go inside, and it turns out that this middle part of your brain can change the way you feel. And that's, of course, what you do in yoga, when you pay deep attention to your inner experience. A bit of a cold. So what turns out is that when you're traumatized, lots of areas of your brain aren't working very well, particularly that part of you that actually needs to monitor yourself. It's called medial prefrontal cortex. This is the part of your brain that can look inside of your soul. And so the more traumatized you are, the harder it is to really go inside. And as some of you may have noticed, for some people, doing yoga is really quite difficult. And being asked to go inside and to experience yourself may be terrifying, because when you're traumatized, the threat that once was out there, the threat is over. That's a thing of the past, but it lives on inside of you. And so when you're traumatized, you don't really want to go inside, because then you feel all this danger inside of yourself. And so traumatized people try to wall themselves off. Traumatized people oftentimes become obese. They may put on a lot of fat to keep the outside world out. They don't want to go inside. And that's what we see all the time with trauma, with yoga, with traumatized people. People become very upset. People get triggered by certain postures, a certain posture. And let's say a posture like the happy baby pose. If you have a history of being raped, putting your pelvis wide open and touching your toes and opening up your pelvis can be a terrifying experience. And so you may see people in your classes who may actually become very upset and very anxious and very panicked as they practice certain poses, because these poses for them become triggers of feeling terror and fear. And so one thing that I liked about my very first yoga teacher, she always gave us three options. She said, now, the next thing, you can do a pigeon pose and you can just put your feet a little bit under your butt, or you can lean over a little bit, and if you want to really do it, just stretch over all the way and touch it. And I think it's just the right thing to do, because we don't want to push people into poses that will make them feel like they're in danger or getting traumatized. So our job as yoga teachers is to very gently help people to go into a state where they can deeply experience themselves. Of course, when you're traumatized, you don't want to deal with your body, because your body is having all these sensations and feelings that make you feel bad. And sometimes it takes a little real hard work to get a traumatized person to actually go to a yoga studio, because doing yoga can be very scary. So you need to very gently help people to go there. And people often ask me, so if people feel scared doing things like yoga, what shall we do? And the answer is always, do yoga. If you're scared doing happy baby pose, which is very understandable after you have been raped, don't say, oh, let's not do it. Then the answer is, how can we do this very slowly and very carefully so you can actually own that part of your body and no longer be afraid of what's happening inside of you. And so, in some ways, as yoga teachers, we are midwives to helping people feel safe in their bodies. And then we started to look at yoga as a way of helping our relationship to our bodies. And because it's so inside, of course, then we start meeting with people who have always done that. And luckily, His Holiness comes to Boston from time to time, so we get to talk about these issues. And what we know is that in order to heal ourselves, we need to go inside and observe ourselves. And one of the first pieces of research that's being done is that there is a part of your brain which happens to be exactly in the area of the third eye, which is such an old Hindu principle, that the size of this part of your brain determines how well you can look into yourself. And it turns out that if you meditate a lot and you do a lot of yoga, you actually grow this part of the brain. So you can actually develop a capacity to that third eye, where you can look at yourself and feel yourself. And that's what current science actually shows very clearly, that it opens up your capacity to see yourself. And that's what you do when you meditate and you do yoga. What also happens when you do yoga, you activate the insula. The insula is a part of your brain sitting over here, tucked away behind your ear, that registers the sensations in your body. And like right now, it's early in the morning here, I haven't had breakfast yet, and I get a little message from my body, hey, I should have had a little breakfast before I talk to these people in India. So I get a little message from my body that I need to go take care of myself. If you're panicky, terrified, angry, upset, frightened, you get messages from your body all the time saying you're in danger, you're heartbroken, your gut is wrenched, and you get the sensations from over here that tell you that the world is dangerous and you need better do something. So what happens is if you get traumatized, you get all these sensations all the time. I'm sure that if you take stock of yourself, you've had that experience when a love relationship doesn't break out. I'm sure there's songs in Hindu about it, about how your heart breaks and your gut wrench. It's in your body. And so if your body is always sending you messages that are terrible, you try not to feel your body. And you learn to cut it off somehow with ganja, with drugs, with alcohol, with cutting yourself. I don't want to have that body of mine. And yoga is really about opening up yourself to your own body. So it's safe again to live inside of the creature that you are. So the insula is the big thing here. In yoga also, it's a signifier of what does it mean, what's going on in my body, and when you're mentally upset, that is where your messages come from, that I am not okay. So it always expresses itself in relationship to other people. You're being afraid to be, you never feel safe with other people, you don't want to be physically close to each other, and you don't like being touched. You cannot say, I'll take care of you and you take care of me. And that's what goes down when you feel traumatized. And even in a room like you, what we see in a yoga class with traumatized people is that everybody wants to sit with their back against the wall. And they want to just be sure that nobody attacks them from the front. And when you work with people who are that frightened, you should give them the space to make themselves as comfortable as they can and help them to make it really, you should work hard on helping people to just be in their bodies and to experience that internal world. And sometimes touch may be helpful, and sometimes touch may be very terrifying. When you have been beaten up or you have been raped, maybe being touched by somebody may feel very threatening. So that's something you need to decide, but don't have an absolute rule about it. You need to see how do people react to your touch of your body. And in America, actually, have some very strong opinions. One side or the other say you should never touch traumatized people, or you should always touch traumatized people. No, it's never black or white. It's never always or not never. And you need to see what this particular person needs. And I'd like to actually go back to, before you're showing me yoga research, about a very interesting gentleman who at some point you were part of the same empire, and much of this work was actually done in India. So back in 1872, so about 150 years ago, Charles Darwin wrote his fantastic book called The Emotional Expressions of Animals and Man. And he decides to see that the most interesting thing in the world, to me at least, is who are these creatures, human beings? They're such strange people. They get angry, upset, they make things difficult, they can build the Taj Mahal, they can kill millions of people. What an amazing weird creatures are we, and how do we fit in the course of evolution? So Darwin collects pictures from all over the British Empire and from India, and puts them side by side to study emotions. And the conclusion he comes to is that man and animals all have the same senses, intuition, sensation, affections, and emotions. So it's part of our evolutionary upbringing. We all get angry, we all get scared, we all get uptight. He then says, he talks about trauma, which he calls behaviors to avoid or escape. Today we call it fight or flight. Fight or flight is very important. And when a truck comes down the street, it's very important for you to run away. When somebody grabs your purse, it's very appropriate for you to go punch him in the nose and get away from me. And those are good survival things that we do. But he says, if you get stuck in it, and that's what happens when you get traumatized, you get stuck in emergency mode. And he says, that's good for the moment, but inappropriately prolonged escape or avoidance behavior, that's what trauma is, put the animal at a disadvantage in that successful species preservation requires reproduction. So he says, the goal of human beings is to make babies. I don't know what the Hindus say about it, but I wouldn't be surprised if you would also say that in the Hindu tradition. And if you get traumatized, he says, it messes up your capacity to have babies, because in order to take care of your children, you need to be calm. You need to depend on feeding, shelter, and mating activities, all of which are the opposite of avoidance and escape. So in order to have an intimate relationship, you need to let go. And you cannot be frightened. And of course, that's what many of us have seen in our own parents, in our own family, that there were members of your family who would become really angry. And you'd say, what's that about? Or they would freeze, or they would get in these strange things all the time that you'd say, they're not really there for us to do things together. And so trauma causes people to not really be very good in the relationships of getting along and doing things well with other people. And then he says, he takes these pictures and he says, men and animals all have the same musculature and breathing apparatuses, and all these emotions have a particular goal. And the goal of anger is to get you to move, say, get away from me. The goal of joy is to go for people like, wow, that guy is having a good time. Let me go to this person. And if you get depressed, you go, or you shut down, and maybe somebody will come and give you some money or take you to the hospital. So the goal of emotion, he says, is movement. And that, of course, is something that's completely lacking in American style, European style psychology, but not in India. You guys know about moving, and you know about moving meditation and moving in yoga, because it's very important when you have a body that's stuck in fight or flight or freeze, that you open up that body to start moving again. And that's why we turn to you, because you know how to do that. So the goal of emotion is to affect physical movement in order to gain a state of physical equilibrium. And so in American science, we have put things together. We looked at the chemicals, and we look at muscles, and we look at this and that. But in yoga, you tie it all together. It's a whole organism and its spiritual reality that needs to be bound together again. That's a very sympathetic way of looking at it. And then Darwin talks in his book that there is a nerve. He calls it the vagus nerve. It's a nerve that runs from the back of your brain into the body and that carries emotions. So this is what Darwin says. Heart, guts, and brain communicate intimately via the pneumogastric nerve, the critical nerve involved in the expression and management of emotions in both humans and animals. When the mind is strongly excited, it instantly affects the state of the viscera. And I read that. I go, yeah, that's right. When you feel terrible, when you feel heartbroken, when something terrible happens to you, you feel it over here, and you feel it over here. So Darwin points out that we live it out in our bodies. Maybe not a strange thing to think about in India, but in America, when I started to say that, the faculty of Harvard people said, he has gone off the deep end. He's crazy. He says it lives in the body. In India, you guys have always known it lives in the body. So this is how it is. And it's this critical nerve, the vagus nerve, that runs from the bottom of your brain into your body. So when you become angry, uptight, or frightened, the first thing it hits is the back of your throat becomes dry. And the second thing it hits, it goes into your larynx, your voice box, and your voice changes. And people can hear how upset you are, or how angry you are, how scared you are, not so much by what you say, but how you say it, how the emotion changes your voice box. And it goes down into your lungs, so the way you breathe affects how your emotion, and then it goes in the theater of your body and your bowels. And so many times these people end up with problems with their bowels. And of course, your medical traditions are much more aware of these connections actually than we are in the West. So the goal of treatment is to know yourself, to feel yourself, to trust yourself, and being somebody. And while I was writing my book, I had a really great time to talk about somebody. In English, you say, oh, he's somebody. And when you're traumatized, you feel like you're nobody because you have no body. So it's all about being in the body. And so how do we deal with people being upset? By touching. There's a beautiful painting from my old countryman, Rembrandt. Times these people that have physical and sensory experiences to unlock their bodies, to activate proper fight-flight responses, to tolerate their sensations, to befriend their internal experiences, and to cultivate new ways of moving. That's what yoga does. I've had a number of students and colleagues who were going through terrible things, and they just went to the yoga class, and they cried, and they cried, and they cried, or they sat by the door, and they just allowed the safety of the room to slowly start coming into them. Very much the yoga space has the potential of becoming a great healing space. And because we have these inbuilt mechanisms that get activated by yoga to help the body to feel calm and to be in charge of itself. Yeah. So the way that we got into it We all get into yoga in a weird way, certainly in America. I got into it via the brain because people started to understand that the way that the heart and the lungs talk to each other is predictable. And they found out, which of course is yogis found out 5,000 years ago, is that here you see the red is your heart rate, the blue is the lungs. So here a person takes an in-breath and your heart rate goes up. You take an out-breath and your heart rate goes down. You take a breath in, heart rate up and out. And so you take a breath out, you slow down the heart. You take a breath in, you speed up the heart. And it turns out that a very important biological, physical function of us is to have a very flexible body in that regard. So that when things are quiet, you feel quiet, and when things are dangerous, you can come up and meet the danger, and when the danger is over, calm yourself down again. So having a very flexible system, it's called heart rate variability, is very important. So here you see the data on a person who came to our lab who was physically in very good shape, had good heart rate variability. So he has nice, slow breathing. Of course, as yoga teachers and other people, we always notice how fast or how slow people's breathing is, because how fast or slow you breathe tells you something about how well you're able to meet the challenges from your environment. And so this guy had a very good baseline, and we played back a memory of his being in a terrible car accident, and at that time, his breathing becomes very fast and very shallow and irregular, but people get upset, their breathing becomes irregular, and the heart rate, the red, is all over the place. But what we see at this point is that he still has these little waves where his heart and his lungs are still in sync with each other. And it turns out that he's okay. He just gets upset being reminded about an old thing, which is not the same as being mentally ill, because we all get upset when we think about very sad things in our lives. That doesn't mean that you're traumatized. Being traumatized is that becomes your habitual way in your body. So this is the person who gets us to do yoga. So here's a very typical patient who will come to my office, a terrible history of abuse and terrible things, and she's uptight. She's frozen. She's barely breathing. Her breathing is very rapid and very shallow. And her heart rate is shut down. So she's just frozen. And maybe some of the people you meet are frozen, because this is a universal issue. This is true wherever you live. And then we play back her history of trauma, and you see why she was so uptight. Because once we open up this trauma, she goes into a panic reaction. And I'm sure all of you will see panic reactions in the yoga classes that you teach, because sometimes when you do some of these poses, people get triggered and they will start behaving as if they're getting raped again. Their bodies feel like the old thing, and their bodies will react. So this woman's body reacts to a story as if she's being raped. Her blood pressure goes, her heart rate goes through the roof, pa, 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 pa. Her breathing goes like that. And after a while, she shuts herself down. And so we become very interested in how can you change that system. And that's how we get into yoga. And what we learn is that if you have good heart rate variability, if this part of your brain is really working well, you can be positive, you're more likely to live long, you're able to put up with stresses. I bet that you should do a study in India to see if the people who practice yoga live longer than people who don't practice yoga. I wouldn't be surprised if you'd find it must be a 10-year difference. Because keeping that system under control is extremely healthy. And if that system is not under control, you're much more likely to become anxious and depressed and to get all kinds of diseases. So it'd be great if one of you writes a doctoral dissertation about mortality in yoga one of these days. And then somebody in England does a study of religious practices, of chanting, Catholic rituals, Hindu rituals, and they find that all these rituals change heart rate variability, change the core system in the brain. So, just after we get into that, these young people walk through the front door of my clinic and say, "Hi, we are a bunch of yoga teachers. Do you think you could use yoga as a treatment of trauma?" And I go like, "That'd be amazing. It'd be so cool. Yes, let's do that." And I say, "No, it's going to be hard because I don't have any money." And they say, "Well, that's good. We don't have any money either, so you cannot have any power over us because we won't have a master-slave relationship." That's good. So we all volunteer our time and start this yoga study. And Satya Kasa is one of our advisors to help us going. And I remember very well when we started, I'm a psychiatrist, and I asked Sabir, "So should we get therapists in the room?" And Sabir says, no therapists. All therapists want to do is talk. And we as yoga teachers, we do things, we help people to move, we help people to breathe. And that continues to be my lesson from Satya Kasa. Yoga is not about talking, it's about doing something with your body. So that's our crew. We start getting together and we first do yoga. No, nobody believes in yoga. This is America. 15 years ago, so people said, what a weird thing to do. So we have a group of chronic patients who we give a treatment to called dialectical behavior therapy. A lot of people do it in America. And we do it for 8 weeks, and nothing changes. And then we have a similar group of people who are slightly better off at the beginning, and they do yoga, and get messed up. And after 8 weeks of yoga, their symptoms go down. So that's interesting. So we do, and then by the time I started to do yoga, I say, when you measure yoga, you shouldn't just measure mental things. You should measure physical things. What happens to the body? How do people experience their body? So you make a scale about the body state. It turns out that after 8 weeks of regular therapy, nothing changes in people's relationship to their bodies. And after 8 weeks of yoga, people's relationship to their bodies change. And now we have enough pilot data, we can go to NIH, and we did the first yoga study for PTSD ever done. And what do we learn? That yoga can change heart rate variability. And that, I don't know if you can see this figure over here. You as a yoga teacher can say that has been shown that yoga changes heart rate variability scientifically. So we studied that, and we see a lot of things. We see that yoga is a very good mental health treatment. In fact, we found out that yoga is more helpful than any psychiatric medication has ever been studied. We published 3 papers on that in major scientific journals, but much to my disappointment, I've never seen a psychopharmacology clinic change into a yoga studio, but I think they should. I think yoga is, for many people, much better than conventional psychopharmacology, and it's also much cheaper, of course. So we do the studies, and we show how well it is, and then we have an interesting thing, and I'm almost finished. So when you do a study, you have to compare what you do with something else. Because when you do a study, you have to prove that this is happening to people, not just because I'm nice to them or pay attention to them. Actually, the method makes a difference. And so we have 2 groups. One is a group of people who get together once a week to talk about how to take care of their bodies, how to sleep well, how to eat well, how to clean yourself, all this sort of stuff. And I asked somebody in my clinic called Ilya to run that group, and the other group is run by yoga teachers. Now we run into serious problem because the yoga teachers tend to be very serious people. And their groups are very serious groups. And the group run by the health educator It's a very funny group. Ilya is a very exuberant, lovely, funny, nurturing person. And so she brings in food every week, and I hear people laugh. And I go like, will you guys please stop laughing? It's unfair to the yoga teachers to have so much fun. And if you keep doing that, it will turn out that your method of laughing with people will be much better than yoga. Could you sort of tone it down and be so serious? And he says, I'll try. But she's just a funny person. So the group is having a great old time. And I fear for the worst, because here we're doing this first study on yoga for mental health, and I think, my God, it's not going to work because the other group is having so much fun. And so then afterwards, we do the analysis. And for the first 8 weeks, indeed, a group of people were talking and having fun and not doing yoga did really great, because they met this very funny, enjoyable person. And they got much better. The yoga group, they go to this yoga group, they touch their toes, they twist in the Bessel. Not all that interesting. And so they very slowly started to get better. And the group was having fun. After 4 weeks, having fun is not good enough. You need to go deeper, and you need to get to know yourself. So this group actually, after a while, doesn't do very well. But the yoga group, by having a steady yoga practice, every week they get a little calmer, a little bit better. Different in culture. India is a slow culture. People take their time. Oh, you have meditated for 20 years, doesn't work yet. Give it another 20 years. In America, everything goes real fast. But yoga is fast and slow and very clear. And then I start interviewing people. And what they say was lovely. They say, after the study is over, I interview people and say, having grown up obese and self-conscious, it was wonderful to be able to move. I felt much more in touch with my body. I learned to be able to focus and sense where my body was. This was my favorite one. So this woman says, I would go to the supermarket and just put food in the basket. And now I go to the supermarket and calmly walk and say, does my body like to eat that? No, it wants to eat that. Oh, do I want to eat? She is much more careful in what I need, so I can nurture myself. I felt stronger. I felt more balanced. I felt connected with my body. I was able to focus. I've always hated my body, and now I learned to take care of my body. Pretty good, huh? I didn't even know that I was at home until I lived at home in my own body. Just being in my body makes me happy. I don't have to do anything, prove anything. That's pretty good. And then we do some brain scans, and we see that exactly the areas that we hope to change, changed. The insula, the part of your brain that connects you with your body, and the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, which is part of the system that allows you to observe yourself, to know yourself, and to take care of yourself. So I'm going down to this. This is what a patient of mine wrote to me. This is a patient who was a person who had been in and out of mental hospitals, who was a woman who would always injure herself, was very depressed, had a horrendous trauma history. And this is what she writes after the yoga class. Yoga is about looking inward instead of looking out and not listening to my body. A lot of my survival after all the horrible traumas I've gone through has been about never feeding my body. I've been refusing to listen to my body, which is such an important part of who I am. I'm so disconnected from my body when I cut it. And in the yoga class, I tried to just noticing the sensations in my body. I noticed when I did that pose, where you thread your arm and twist your pelvic floor, I felt my pelvis was all there was to me. I was just one big pelvis. I'm just sexually abused. I slowly learned to just have my feelings without being hijacked by them. Life is more manageable. I'm more attuned to my day, more present in the moment. I'm more tolerant of physical touch. My husband and I enjoy watching movies together, cuddle in bed. I can finally feel intimate with my husband. That's about as good an outcome as a person can ever hope to look for. So just to end up here, So what I'm telling you about is that you happen to be involved in a very sacred thing. Yoga is sacred, and it's a beautiful way to help people to be in their bodies, to be in community, and to have a spiritual practice. And I think there is a very important place for you yoga people to be our teachers and to be our healers in all of our societies. And it's a privilege for me to talk to you guys. I wish I was there and I could follow your work, because I also have a lot to learn still. Thank you very much. So there's some questions now.
Thank you, Dr. Bessel, for such an insightful presentation. It is of vital importance that we understand how trauma works, especially for yoga teachers and practitioners. With how mainstream yoga is now, it is knowledge and deep understanding like this that sets a teacher apart. Knowing how to guide the student and creating the right environment through yoga by opening up the body to live within it, and specifically understanding how each individual is different, and like you said, playing the role of a midwife there and catering to them accordingly. I hope our participants and students understand the gravity of the responsibility we hold when taking up the role of a yoga teacher. So now we have a few questions. Taking the first question. So what made you come into trauma, and why did you choose this field of research?
You know, our mind makes specializations. Journalists ask me all the time, how you get into it. You know, most of us have been traumatized. I was actually born in the middle of a famine. I was a very, very fragile little kid. I grew up during the war in the Netherlands, and a large number of people who started. If that has something to do with my getting into it, it's possible. I'm one of 5 kids. My brothers and sisters have absolutely no interest in trauma. I also have always been very interested in science, but I also have written poetry and painted since I was a young kid. And for me, doing this work of trauma allows me to take care of both my artistic needs and my scientific needs. And so how does this happen? A lot of life happens by chance. You meet the right teachers, and you meet the right methods that resonate with you. And I'm sure that if I'd grown up in India, I would have become a very different person than growing up where I have, because it's all circumstantial. Yeah.
Okay. We'll take the next question.
Yes.
How is it that the breath is so deeply connected to emotion? What is the neuroscientific basis of breathing becoming so powerful so as to regulate emotion?
Well, that's the core issue. The question in science is never why. The question is how. It's a fact. It just yogis knew before anybody else that if you focus on the out breath, you activate the parasympathetic nervous system, and by activating the parasympathetic nervous system, you calm your sensations, your body down. And if you do like Kundalini, where you activate the breath very fast, then you activate people's minds. And before going into battle, let's say, where you want to go out and kill people, you want to pump it up, get your adrenaline going, old Indian knowledge that if you do focus your in-breath, you get activated, and you focus on your out-breath, you calm yourself down. So that's just the way that we were created. Yeah. Next question.
Yoga also we have the focus on the out-breath being almost in double, the ratio being 1:2 in the pranayama practice as well, to extending the exhale. Okay, we take the next question. What if the trauma faced has happened from the unethical behavior of a yoga teacher in the class? How do we deal with such a situation when the very thing to avoid becomes yoga?
I think it's a terribly important question, and something that happens all the time, because we live in cultures where we give people a lot of power. That certainly happens in India, even more than in America, actually. That people have a tradition of revering the teacher and ascribing a lot of wisdom to the teacher, and maybe not so much wisdom to the student. Culturally, it's a little bit different in America. We tend to not idealize teachers quite as much as you do in India. And what we have seen over and over again is if you give the teacher too much power, the teacher is very often abuses it. And it happens right here where I live, and in Kapalu, we had a teacher who told everybody you have to be celibate. But at the same time, he was actually having sex with many of the students himself. He told everybody you have to be celibate. I've seen this so many times. If you give people too much power, they will abuse it. And so that's part of the danger of having these hierarchical structures in yoga teachings, in religious structures, and other places where if people get too much power, they're likely to abuse it. And then people will have a very hard time speaking up because people will feel ashamed about their feelings, and they cannot not offend this very important person. And it's part of becoming a democratic society, which of course is in danger in India also right now, where you can speak the truth. And I think a very important part of a culture of learning and not doing trauma is that people can speak the truth. And if somebody does something to you that's unethical, that you can go and say, that was not okay. And don't get scared. But in ashrams, more often than not, if you have been abused, you become silent and you become an outcast. And it's a very common, repetitive thing. And I'm really glad you asked about it, because you all need to discuss among yourselves how you will deal with excesses and dangerous behavior by people who take too much power.
Thank you, sir, for shedding light on that and giving us some clarity. Speaking the truth is also one of the foremost yamas in the practice of yoga, satya.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to put up the next
theory. A theory, but in practice, you are very hierarchical. You cannot speak truth to power. And so these strong hierarchical structures, which are still alive and well in India, also put you at the risk of allowing perpetrators to come to a position of power in an unmatched way. So keep an eye on this. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll put up the next question out here, coming from Laurie. Namaste. Thank you for a wonderful talk, and thank you, Kavalyadham, for hosting. Could you please share a bit about the specific yoga practices that were part of the first studies on yoga and PTSD? Also, in the US, yoga therapy is often one-on-one, whereas yoga classes tend to be in groups. Many trauma-informed yoga classes focus on safe space and avoiding triggers, whereas in yoga, the therapist can work with titration and yogic counseling. Could you speak to the scope of the practice for a yoga therapist in such a relationship?
And something that has not been settled yet. At our own trauma center, David Emerson ran his program. At the end, we didn't quite agree on some things. David said, you should never touch your patients. I said, no, sometimes it's okay to touch your patients. You need to really go from case to case. And I'm also friendly with people of Phoenix Rising Yoga who train practitioners in trauma therapy. But the main thing about yoga is that it's not really therapy. Yoga is a practice. Yoga is something that you do, and where there's not a lot of talking. And what I'm always, so maybe Sabir can say something about it. As a psychotherapist, people tell me what it is like to do their various poses. As a yoga teacher, you don't talk about it. You go through the exercises, but you don't always know what goes on with people. And if I were a yoga teacher at a place that of healing, I would also want to have a little bit of talk about what pose is comfortable for you, what can we work on, what particular pose is threatening to you, How can we make it easier for you to go to? And the natural tendency is that if something is unpleasant or threatening, to either in India possibly to push people through it and do it anyway, or maybe in America, let's not do it because it makes you feel uncomfortable. And I think the critical thing is to recognize that it's that here's a stress point, and that our job becomes to very slowly help people with the use of breath, sometimes with the use of touch, to go into that pose that starts off being very threatening, but it needs to be done very gently and very carefully, and people need to be able to say, stop, I don't want to go any further. Because when you get traumatized, people do things to you and you cannot stop it. But in a healing practice, you can say, no, I don't want to do this. This is too much. And so much of a yoga practitioner would be to really almost seduce people into, let's try it a little bit more. One of the ways that I think one of the powerful things that you have as a yoga teacher is counting the breath. For example, I'm not a kid anymore, and you can well imagine that I'm a stiff old white guy. And so when I go to yoga class and the teacher says, let's do a warrior 3. I don't want to do warrior 3. You know, I'm going to fall over and humiliate myself and like, no, I don't want to do that. And this very nice yoga teacher will say, we'll do it for 5 breaths. And I think, okay, I'll give you 1 breath. And I go, and I hear you say, 2, okay, 3, 4, 5, it's over. So the timing of your teacher says, we'll do it for 5 breaths. Try it for 3 breaths. Try it for 2 breaths. And really experimenting how much you can tolerate. And then afterwards it's over, you said, oh, I did it. I did a warrior 3. Is that amazing? So it's very gently guiding people in a very gentle way. And if people say, I can't do it, to say, okay, we'll try it next time. But we'll try it next time. It's not like we won't have to do it, because we need to own our bodies. That's one of the things that Dave and I, at the end, had a hard time about. He said, no, you need to do every pose. You need to learn to do every pose, because if you want to own your body, you have to do all the practices. And if you ignore certain things, then the person who hurts you still owns part of your body. We need to own our own bodies. I hope this helps. Yeah.
We would again like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Bessel for accepting our invitation and addressing us all. His book, The Body Keep the Score, is highly respected in the field of psychology and has been translated in 36 languages. Before we proceed further with our day, I would like to bring to your notice that for our on-site participants, the recordings will be present for 7 days on the same login page, and for our offline participants who are joining us here, you will be sent all the recordings through the email that you have registered with. We now have a short we, we now have a short tea break at Patanjali Circle. We expect everyone to be back by 3:25 for our first panel discussion on the topic mainstream psychotherapy and yogic mind body therapy opportunities for an integration. Thank you.